Hi everyone. I don't know. I'm in the habit of saying good morning, but I know everyone is coming from different time zones. So I'm glad that everyone is doing okay, and I'm glad that you were able to join us today. We just wanted to start off with some brief introductions, just to kind of let everyone know who we are and where we're coming from. So, my name is Dominique Thomas. I'm the editor of the Community Psychologist, which is the newsletter for the Society for Community Research and Action. And I got my I got my bachelor's in psychology from Morehouse College, and my master's and PhD in community psychology from Georgia State University. And I recently did 2 years of a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan at the National Center for Institutional Diversity. That's a mouthful. And I did a lot of work with the public scholarship editorial board and then public scholarship publications. So I brought some of that experience into the work I've been doing with the TCP and also with other special issues that I've been editing across different journals and platforms. So that's just a little bit of who I am and where I'm coming from. So I want to pass it over to Jerry.
hmm Yep, thank you. So I'm honored today to be able to just share this space with Dr. Thomas for a little bit. We have had lots of conversations around many of these topics or related topics in the past in Sarah and other spaces. And so we are happy you're joining us today. Little land acknowledgement. I am sitting on the land of Peoria, Kickapoo, Sioux, Miami, and Potawatomi indigenous peoples. And so we want to just make sure we acknowledge that before we began. I earned my PhD from National Louis University here in Chicago, where I am, and I'm a practitioner by nature, or have served in the community for any number of years as a senior and middle executive level at a couple of nonprofit organizations, primarily revolving around housing and homelessness. And so when I conducted my dissertation, I looked at homelessness, particularly involving Black African American males in particular. And one of the things I certainly found is that African American males are overrepresented in the homeless system. And so, which led to really delving into this. Looking at systemic issues and looking at structural systems of oppression and any inequity, and leading to this place that I am now. So currently, I'm assistant professor at Adler University. I teach community psychology, social psychology, and a cultural studies course. And I am also the co-founder, managing director of Community Wellness Institute, and it's primarily an umbrella for all of the community work I do, including facilitating, the lead facilitator on what we call the Face of Justice workshops around anti-racist, anti-blackness practices. And they range anywhere from understanding institutional racism to dismantling structural violence in America's education system. And so that's the work that I do. Dominique I and Jessica Fernandez has just got out an issue, the special issue of the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice. So please take a look at that when you get a chance. And it's certainly around the articles are around this issue of achieving and practicing racial justice. And so, long story short on that for me. And again, we welcome you and appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Jerry. So we wanted to kind of start off with, I guess, the main point of our plenary session is, how we have been, in many ways throughout our careers, trying to, how we have been trying to disrupt power and the number of different ways that it shows up in the academy and other educational spaces. So with my research interest being with campus racial climate on university, well, in university settings, both in a place like maybe a public PWI, but also maybe a minority serving institution, and looking at how the different aspects of racial climate may either align or differ from those settings based on the perspectives of the students. And I wanted to get the perspective of the students in terms of creating these scales and these studies, because too often when these constructs are created or thought of or conceptualized, the people who are most likely to experience that phenomena directly are not as involved in the process of that intellectual labor, so to say, of developing or doing the validation studies or everything involved with these studies. So I, being a student at the time, figured, well, shouldn't these measures have more of our imprint or say so in terms of what they look like and what experiences are actually being measured or assessed, and for whose purposes are these studies being assessed, or these studies being created, which goes into how power gets reproduced in the academy, because certain interests have to be served. So is it the students who ended up being served, or is the other forces at play that are driving and influencing the decisions of stakeholders within the university, whether it be students, teachers, staff, administrators? And one of the ways in which I've seen this happen is one through just the social class reproduction of the academy. So I recently found a study that said that PhD professors are 25 times more likely than the general population to have had PhDs as parents. So that right there already like demonstrates a reproduction of power dynamics. So people who have PhDs tend to come from more affluent backgrounds than the general population, and they also are way more likely to have had PhD parents. So you see this social class reproduction happening from the university setting, and it gets even deeper when you start thinking about the theories that come out of different academic institutions or academic disciplines, and just the ways in which historically these theories have been used to uphold unjust systems. So something like eugenics isn't just something that comes out of thin air. That's an academic project. Like social Darwinism isn't just something that comes out of thin air. That's an academic project. That was at a time the predominant view of a predominant view in social science, particularly as it came to racial differences. That was just the standard of science, of social science at that time. So just in the theories that have been historically created in the academy, and the ways in which people are socialized in the academy, and how it also can reproduce already existing class and racial power structures, we see how this power reproduction in the academy is so hard to stop, how this wheel is so hard to break. And I just wanted to push it over to Jerry to see what you think about that in terms of, in your work, how you've noticed that power gets reproduced in the academy.
Yeah, thanks, Dom, for that. So when I think about power reproduction in the academy, of course, I think about it from the perspective of leaving the nonprofit industrial complex, right? You know, that was my world for any number of years, and I hadn't really thought about it, although I knew that something was going on within that industry in terms of funding and who got it, and corporations and their connections and relationships, right, with nonprofit CEOs and leaders. And as a African American executive director at that particular time, and still even now, it's not that common. So the space that I occupied was pretty much occupied by white males, right, and so their relationships to CEOs, corporation and CEOs were different from mine, and so that's who got the funding. So, to that end, when I decided to move into academia and not leave the community, but move into academia as a way to continue the work that I was doing. And of course, I'm always seeking to be in a space where I have some influence over funding and those things, decision making at that end. So moving into the academic area, of course, I ran into the academic industrial complex, right? And so now I'm understanding fully. I'm like, okay, how they say you run from one space to another, and that's okay, because now I'm looking at reproduction. Now I'm looking at this way of reducing social institutions to a marketplace, in other words. And what's the currency? Degrees, right? And even though we know we want to leave, or we want to obtain a position where we can pay mortgage, etc. But the other side, flip side of that, right, is that education has become a currency or an instrument for economic progress, moving away from its original role, or its supposedly original role, and that, of course, is looking at human development. This way of building character, etc., and what that looks like. And so, if we think with Max Weber to this end, he shared something interesting. Was that he saw children, or he felt that the education, higher ed, sees children as raw materials for the reproduction of adults, right? And so, if you are reproducing capitalism, or you're reproducing wealth, well, when you have students in the institution, in the academy, then that becomes the primary goal to that. And interestingly, Durkheim shared something as well. Emil Durkheim shared that he sees this as a mechanism where adults exercise their influence over the younger, or over students in general, in order to maximize the status quo they desire. And so when you look at it from that perspective and see the colonialism attached to it, the colonialism ideology attached to that, and we talked earlier this week about disrupting the status quo. And along with the line of what you shared, when we are talking about ideologies versus a surface type of situation, this is embedded. And you're right, I agree with you in that it is not that easy to dismantle or disrupt. So you and I and other colleagues spend quite a bit of time thinking about this in our writing, and in the special issue, and the TCP, that you've done a wonderful job in bringing forward, including this information in there. And I'm always appreciative of your work in disrupting the way that the knowledge is disseminated and in that area. So yeah, I totally agree, and yeah, appreciate the time to share that little bit.
And the intersections of those two areas, the academic industrial complex and the nonprofit industrial complex, and community psychology being right in the middle of both of those, and having to, in many ways, abide by the logics of both of those different types of areas, domains, or complexes. There's also the silences that get noticed as well too. It's like, okay, what are the things that are left unnamed, the people who are left unrepresented? Like, what stories are left out of the narrative? What stories are left out of the history? What type of history of community psychology are we taught? Is it a history that actually encompasses the full breadth and context of everything that was happening in the world around CP during its development? Or is it more of an insular narrative that focuses mostly on like the achievements of academics or of more traditional scholars? Like, does the history that we tell of community psychology actually align with the values that the field purports to have? So when we say that we value social change, do we recognize the social movements that came before that actually provided the groundwork or the soil for community psychology to grow out of? Does community psychology exist without, say, the civil rights movement, or even more radical groups such as maybe like the Black Panthers? Like, does some of what community psychology purport to value have indebtedness to groups that don't get named?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the epistemological violence when communities are always conceptualized as the other and never as someone who could eventually be be an equal, or the seemingly absent idea that when you're talking about someone from these quote marginalized or quote oppressed communities, that any of them can end up being your colleague that in the future, and you're going to have to actually look a person in the face of which that group of which you were talking about, and have to reckon with, well, does what I thought about this group actually line up with reality, or is it just an academic theory that was relatively detached from the true experiences of the people that it was supposed to be about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've hit upon some really core points, right? And I think if we think through this and answer the questions, right? They are rhetorical in a way, but in a way they're not. And so we should be answering the questions. And so when we look at them, I think that we have to say that historically, and I'm hoping that with programs like National Louis University and other programs that are looking uh, to transform is the word that I want to use, the field of community psychology, critical community psychology, and other efforts to do so. I am hopeful in that sense. But if we look back at what you're sharing is no, the literature, the canons of community psychology doesn't include the Black Panthers, and a bit is said about Martin Luther King, maybe in some spaces and not around the civil rights movement. But prior to that, when we think about the Black Panthers, we have to also think about Steve Biko and Black consciousness movement in Africa, right? When we are looking at how apartheid was dismantled. And so to that end, and it's important when we leave that out, because then we don't know that thinking about Black consciousness is removing or replacing the small b in Black, right, to a larger B, because Black's a crayon. Black is a color with a small b, but it's moving that to a larger B, that becomes people now. And so what that does when we leave that the voices of BIPOC out, for me, of the literature, of the textbooks, etc., then there's no relationship there. So like you said, now when you're looking at someone who is a Black African American community psychologist, you don't have a relationship with them if you're not in that space, if you're not BIPOC, because you have described them as subjects, and you've described them as minoritized. You've described them as marginalized, and they're over there. And so let's go over there and help them. And over there is always leading back to there's no relationship there, if that makes sense.
Right. And yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I just thought about W.E.B. Du Bois and the ways in which his scholarship was both both academic innovation, but also speaking truth to power. So
Mm-hmm.
as essentially the first scientific sociologist, he innovated an entire discipline of study in order to essentially in order to scientifically prove the humanity of Black people in a society in which the scientific establishment had determined that Black people were inferior. So Du Bois had to actually go over and beyond what science was at the time to prove something that we now, well, it apparently is not still taken for granted, but you know, that's something that should be taken for granted is that, oh, we're all equal. And it's just the amount of work liberation focus.
Yeah, Dom, you got cut out about a few minutes ago, so we
oh no,
what you're sharing. Yeah, no, just go back for it, okay, please. And
but Du Bois essentially having to innovate sociology to prove the humanity of Black people, which proves that oftentimes scholars, in order to properly represent the communities from which they come, have to actually create some kind of a rupture or disruption of the power structure of the field itself. So there wasn't money that was going to his research because his research was totally counter-hegemonic, even though it was the epitome, it was like cutting edge science, but it was all done with people who were motivated to liberate themselves, people who were motivated to help others around them liberate themselves, and people were doing this for free. So this is what happens when you have resource-starved scholars who are trying to engage in liberation work or create schools of thought that are counter-hegemonic. They have to just rely on others who have the same goal of liberation in mind. And that's what pushes people through beyond just the motivation of individual self-gain and profit. And you see a similar ethos in, you know, in future Black campus movements throughout different universities and campuses in which students are trying to change the ways in which their universities are structured. And you have the interplay between Black student unions and the Black Panthers, who were born out of college student organizing. And then you see the full circle of pretty much now most Black student unions across the country having in some way modeled themselves off of the Black Panthers, because a lot of places have some type of a 10-point platform, and that came from the Black Panthers.
That's right.
And other things that we and other things that are the brainchilds of like the Black Panthers are free food and breakfast program. That didn't exist until the Black Panthers created it, and then the government, and as a way of trying to, you know, delegitimize the Black Panthers, eventually gave that away as something to the people from the government, but that idea was originally created by the Black Panthers. And also sickle cell disease research. That wasn't a thing until the Black Panthers started doing sickle cell research. So they did things on behalf of the community that the state, the academic institutions were not going to offer to Black communities, and in some ways were actively working to keep out of Black communities. Free health clinics, sickle cell disease research, free food and breakfast for children. Like, these were things that they were doing that actually were tangible benefits to the communities. So when I think of how this history has to constantly be dug up and reclaimed and like re-excavated because of just the things that keep it hidden, it's a bit frustrating, but it also gives you a way of seeing that, okay, this work has been done before. There are ways of actually making substantial change that might end up making it national, even if you don't necessarily know in what ways that it's going to get there.
Yeah.
But also the unfortunate reality that some of the things that we take for granted as just being, you know, standard things that we offer here in America, people literally died to create and to keep going, and were actually repressed by the state and were prevented by the state from doing that very thing. They destroyed food in the raids. They destroyed food for the free breakfast program during police raids. And they explicitly targeted the Panthers because of those free breakfast programs. Like, they wanted to shut down the free breakfast programs because they knew that would actually get support from people, because who's going to be mad at anybody feeding kids?
Absolutely, they're not going to see them as anti uh, social, anti well-being, healthy well-being, right? When they are offering that, and one of our audience members, Dr. Meek, shared that the after-school programs was
Hmm.
another concept that came out of the Black Panthers and Black Power movement. And in looking at this too, I wanted to add, before Kendi is Dr. Kendi, Vibram Rogers, and to read the book. I'm getting an echo here, so I'm hoping that that's not on the other end. But he wrote the book on the Black Campus movement, actually, right? And he identified four entrenched or embedded elements that had long undergirded the racial makeup of higher education. And that was the moralized contraption. And if anybody wants more information on these four elements, they're very interesting. And he mentions too as the standardization of exclusion, that it's exclusion is pretty much standardized, right? And then three was the normalized mask of whiteness. And he shares that exclusion was not merely standardized in 1965 at the start of the Black campus movement. Those who kept African Americans at bay projected the exclusionary environment as the norm. Nations or notions of objectivity are Eurocentric universities, a Eurocentric universalism, and evolutionism are a few of the many constructs that academics, politicians, and benefactors use to mask the predominance of whiteness. And then that last concept that's worthy of mentioning is was that four? He's got one, more moralized conception or contraption, standardization of exclusion, and I think there was also one more. But having said all of that, this goes back again to no mention of these foundations that when you look at community psychology today, it would have to have some parts of it. So this reminds me of something that I want to make mention here, and we definitely can move on, is my sister and I were doing or conducting a workshop on structural violence or dismantling structural violence in America's education system. And we came across some research that shared, and I don't know if others might know this or not, and I think this is related to this co-opting or this way of not including the foundation of how these movements come about. And this was around Maslow and the what is that self-actualization hierarchy or ladder.
Hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, but that came out of the Blackfeet, right? So, we're looking at this and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, wait a minute now, Maslow touts this though as his own theory. And you mentioned this earlier. And to that end, you look at this and you say, well, wow, where is the credit? It was a indigenous practice already that he revised and remodeled into this actualization ladder. And it just takes you to those places. And you're right, it's quite frustrating. And then you realize that you don't know these foundations, but they are incredibly instrumental in the discipline coming about.
Right. And it just reveals also like the roots of settled colonialism and like the whole structure, because it's so embedded in the way everything gets presented and represented. And I think about this in terms of epistemology and liberation.
Mm-hmm.
So who is it that gets to define and or create reality? Who is it that gets to say, this is what actually happened, this is what's history, this is what the future is going to be? Who is it that actually has the power in society to define those things? And when you lack the history of your own, context, you lack the ability to define and create your own future. So that's why for me personally, conscious consciousness raising and political education are really important, and I try to incorporate that into everything that I do in some form or fashion, whether it's the way in which I have taught my classes before.
Yeah.
So in African American psychology, I found out that I had to do more political education than I thought going in, because so much of the foundation of what I'm teaching has to be set up by a dismantling of a different foundation of traditional psychology, because of the history that's often left out of
Mhm.
traditional psychology, whether it's the perpetuation of eugenics or all the different ways in which psychology helped to actually uphold racial segregation and the racial oppression of different groups,
Yeah.
and how subdisciplines or classes like African American psychology have to actually grapple with that history and say, okay, well, these theories actually came from this because this person was literally a eugenicist and they wanted to prove that Black people were inferior. So
Mhm.
this is
Mhm.
why this theory had so many legs, so much energy for so long, because it was something that was a part of the status quo. Social Darwinism wasn't isn't a fringe theory when we're talking about the 1950s. So it's a matter of providing a political context for why these theories
That's
ended
right.
up having such an impact, even though now they seem ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
even with
can go back to the bell curve, so don't put me in that space. Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
and,
Right.
right. And even with community psychology, like some of the gaps that we just mentioned, like I found myself having to fill those gaps. So I showed my students a documentary about the Black Panthers, and I talked about in my classes too about um, how slavery was central to the American economy, and how so much so much of America's like status as an economic superpower is because of unpaid slave labor, and how this wasn't just perpetuated by the plantation owners, but it was banks, it was textile mills, it was universities. Like universities were hiring people to manage their affairs because these people were good at managing the affairs of the plantation owners and all of uh, their business partners.
Mhm.
So people who were good at managing the finances of the slave owners were also hired by the universities to manage their um, finances. So it's literally the same types of economic thinking that are driving both the decisions of universities and the decisions of plantation owners. So it's understanding like that deep history that I would have to like start with before I got into the theories that I was going to be talking about in the class, because you then have to start kind of operating from a different epistemological framework too, because
Mhm.
you're now operating from a different lane of how reality is defined in your society, because you're not using the hegemonic view of reality anymore. You're
Yep.
using the hidden subjugated knowledges now.
Yep.
And I think that's why I've tried to include or create space for different knowledges that haven't gotten the proper light through either special issues or on the TCP podcast or through different plenaries. And just trying to open up the discussion, or at least open up space so other people can like make themselves known, because it doesn't because when I liberate myself, I'm helping you liberate yourself as well too. Like we have to be co-liberators, so we
Yes.
always have to be thinking about what space we're opening for others as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's Audre Lorde's point, right? About the shackles or the liberation. If you come to what did she say? I can't get it quite, but she says if you've come for something about liberation, right? If your liberation is caught up in mind or et cetera, something to that end. So absolutely. And I'm in the same space, in the classroom. Uh, teaching culture diversity. I don't just start with the standard list, right? This work that I do, really kind of began, well, had its impetus in a number of things, but one of them is looking at diversity as this buzzword and realizing that diversity is an equity. This isn't synonymous for that, and so kind of parceling through that, lends itself to taking in the cultural studies course with rather than starting with the standard ethnicity, religion, age, all the factors that certainly encompass diversity. I have to take them all the way back to colonialism, to when Europe was a peninsula with no money and no standing on the world stage, right? And so their biggest thing is, how do we figure out, well, how are we going to get there? This is like, if anybody remembers Pinky and the Brain, and Pinky says to the brain, well, what are we going to do today? And the brain says, we're going to try and take over the world. Right. So, you got to go back to realizing this wasn't always the case. So how do we make this happen on the world stage to compete with China and India? Well, we're going to make that happen through conquest and domination. Right. That's been the standard prior to that. The penetrating Africa didn't just began, at that point, that was always the case. And so having to, take back and give some context is what I'm sharing to what we're saying, and not just taking the pieces we see in contemporary textbooks or contemporary books, but going back to what is the context behind it. And then I think that's when people have, as Oprah would say, that aha moment. It's like, well, what's so difficult about saying this or sharing this? That race is a social construct, and here's why, right? That when we use it to segregate, when we use a term, and I'm big on language, and I won't delve into that here because I know we want to leave some room for, I see a lot of questions come up, but we have to go back to this language of barbarism, is it barbarism, barbaric, these words like savagery, etc., and then move forward to this space where the settler is always looking to civilize, right? Groups of people that aren't of the same, have the same color skin. And so, yeah, so in the classroom, I'm always there, and I'm always looking to it at uh, the Black feminists like Bell Hooks, in writing, teaching to transgress. I mean, it's almost, a standard for bringing it forward today into the classroom, because she says at one point, multiculturalism compels educators to recognize the narrow boundaries that have shaped the way knowledge is shared in the classroom. It forces us all to recognize our complicity in accepting and perpetuating biases of any kind. And so, there's the phenomenal way that they have of looking at this situation, of looking at the prevailing social issue of racism and those isms and so forth, is gives us this view and this lens that if we give that to our students, if we give that away, they have a different way of looking at things. And I don't go into the classroom in particular to say, you've got to do this or you've got to do that or learn this or learn that. I say, you know what? I'm going to just give you another lens to look through. And then you decide what you see through it, right? And, in that way, rather than this way we have. And then I look to the two intellects and Black intellectuals, like you said, W.B. Du Bois and Jimmy Baldwin, and when we can look to those foundationals, I'm an Angela Davis fan, no matter what, and the meaning of freedom. And she puts forward that, the strategies we used yesterday in revolutionary work, we need to be looking at them because they don't work today, or they may not work today, right? You just can't pile this stuff up and say, okay, here's what we did. Now we are going to do that. We have to revise and configure and move into the spaces that are going to put us where we need to be today. We're both fans of Franz Fanon, the post-colonial theories, Homi Bhabha said, and those people that give us this clarity on language and he talks about between the French and this Creole language, right? That reduces men and human beings to pretty much property, right? When we're talking, shadow property, etc. So yeah, I totally agree that we have to dig in. And you brought up the Philadelphia Negro, and I said, wow, I've seen this in W.B. Du Bois' work. And when you brought it up, and it talks about, darn near the first social psychologists or did this work, but we don't have any mention of him in this contemporary space that we're holding today. So yeah, totally.
And I think another important thing about everything we just mentioned is how easy this information is to access for people and whether or not people can actually make use of it, and why it's important to really have that in mind, because if we're not actually thinking about what what people can use the information for in terms of practically using it, not just
Mhm.
for more theory making,
Right. Yes.
what is really the point of it? What is the point of any of the work that we do if it's only ever going to end up in an academic journal and it's just going to circulate and create more theory rather than anything that's actually going to go out into the world and actually motivate or spark or help drive something that creates change in the world.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think we can talk about both issues, but also like what we hope for the future, because we do feel like that there's still hope. That no, not that there's still hope. There's always hope.
Yeah.
Um, so I know for me, my hope is, and I've been seeing more of it, is just the idea of multiple community psychologies, not just one community psychology, because more and more we're at a point in history in which it may require not one bullet point one magic bullet solution, but maybe like a multiplicity or a cosmology of solutions, just a wider range, a wide array of strategies, tactics that have to be at play simultaneously to get things moving in the right and proper direction. So I see like decolonization meaning that community psychology isn't just beholden to one or two domains, but is really for the community or for the people, and that community psychology, when we think of the community, that the community psychologist isn't necessarily or inherently thought of as separate from the community, that any community could have potentially a community psychologist, or anyone can be a community psychologist without necessarily having to have, I know some people may not like this, but like without necessarily having to have the 5 to 6 years PhD. Like, do we only want to validate academic work as being valid community psychology, or only academics as being like the real community psychologists? Like, what type of power are we reproducing when we don't think about these things?
Mhm.
But my hope is that there'll be enough space for that. There will be space for everybody.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I concur with that. And I think one of the things that I want to bring up is we were having a session earlier on textbooks, and of course we know that uh, my hope is that we remove BIPOC individuals, families, and communities from the line of subjects. That I'm saying that again, and I'm reiterating that when we narrate from the lens of that uh, lens of colonialism, of settler nations, of white supremacist ideology, from the lens of any of those things that we are describing people as subjects. And it's over there that has to not be the standard anymore. As Kendi shared, the standard has to be, we must look through these collective eyes, and in that way we build relationships. In other words, that when we're talking about a community, we're talking about it from a relationship standpoint. And so that brings me to the book that Dr. Viola and I and a couple of other editors are working on, is the community case studies in community psychology practice, a global lens. And I bring it up because it's one of the things that the intentional work was to offer. Well, one is to dismantle academic or disparities in academic publishing and the inequity there. But two is to intentionally invite this group that you're talking about, this collective group of people, particularly giving opportunities for BIPOC individuals to get their work into a rigorous, into a space where it's being seen. And so these are the things that, to your point, is everything has to be, uh, filled up with APA formatting, and if you don't, it's not accepted in the peer-reviewed journals. And hats off to Nicole Friend and everybody at the American Journal, and anybody that's rethinking, reimagining how we put forward the work of all the people that matter. Because if we're community psychologists, then all people matter. We got to move away from tying up, binding up, constraining the works of people who can come forward and put a dent, at least, maybe not in my time, but somebody else's time, and eradicate racism, or just began to move in the space again where we are not constraining knowledge, where we are not tying it up, binding it up. But and I mentioned, for example, I was looking at a CV of somebody as sitting on a search committee the other day, and the person shared, well, it's great that I like in the field of psychology, they're gatekeepers. And of course, I was like, well, I'm looking at it like, not gate anything but gatekeepers, right? Where we're all striving to move away from this type of gatekeeping, where again we are controlling knowledge and the gates, etc. So yeah, my hope is that we, all of these things, and it's not an easy fix, it's not uh, a easy challenge, a easy task, but of course, I think that we can do it. And so when we move in this transformation space, I think that we can. I'm like you. There's always hope, and we can answer the call. I'm pretty sure. So, yep. I appreciate.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
No, I was just gonna say I thank you for that. And um yeah, it's a long road to go, but you know, change is always happening, but it's how we best ride that wave that matters. So how do we best move forward with, not against the grain, but heading in the direction that gets us to hopefully a point of liberation or and decolonization.
Yes.
So we have 10 minutes left for any questions or any Q&A or any questions that you might have had for us, or just any comments or reactions. We just wanted to give some time at the end for a bit more of a back and forth.
And if you have a question you'd like to share, either please put it in the chat now, or you can use the raised hand feature.
Okay. So I think one of the questions early on, Dom, came from Christopher Beasley, who shared, someone who could never help her mindsets are so detrimental. So what does it mean to see the helpee as one's peers? And I don't know if these are questions for us or just questions for thought, but also what does it mean for the helper's self to be on the same level as the helpee? Is that a question, Christopher, you want us to put out there to kind of take a look at, or more rhetorical and a great comment?
I think it'd be great. I think originally it was rhetorical, but it'd be great to have your thoughts on that, because I think that it's endemic in social work and education, and to some extent, and certainly like clinical psychology, and it's the roots of community that sort of helpy mindset. Yeah, I just wonder how that maintains the status quo, and what that means for the helpee if others are the helper, if the helpee is to sort of rise to that level and be seen in that level.
Mhm. Yeah, Dom, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think something that happens with this helper mindset and it being detrimental to empowerment is that when someone from that group actually does end up being your equal, you still can't see them as your equal.
Mm.
Like you still, to some degree, treat them as a lesser, and in some ways still as like a help fee.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's sometimes when you don't check that going in, like you still end up treating people as less than your equal, even if a person has professionally risen to the rank of equal. And I think it is the issue of that relationship of viewing yourself as the helper and the other person as the helpee, and that just such clear power differential. It's the differential of power that still persists and maintains, because how can you really empower someone when you're already starting off from the perspective of it's you who's giving them power, or it's you that's the reason why they're finding the empowerment, and less so that that person already had it in them. It just took hearing it from another person to activate that. Not a person who's above them, but just another person who is equal yet with a different expertise. Um, yeah, because I've had situations in which someone has come to me as a scholar on has come to me on a scholar on campus climate, on Black populations, and has asked something like, "Oh, well, we're having problems recruiting African American males at our school. Like, why do you think that's the case?" And given an answer along the lines of structural inequities, systemic racism, all those other structural factors that prevent people from getting to higher education before you even talk about what happens on a college campus. But then the response being, I think it's hip hop culture. I think hip hop culture makes them not value education. So it's still just, so even, yeah, so right, I see people's reactions, and it's still just that idea of, you ask a Black scholar who has expertise on Black people how you can help Black people get to a point, but when that scholar gives you an answer that doesn't necessarily validate the quote help that you're giving, you see how people then react, and then that whole idea of you being the helper gets kind of wounded. Because as much as I hate to say it, I think to a degree people are trained to over-identify with being a community psychologist, and that takes up too much of like a person's self-concept of themselves, and that further perpetuates this idea of the helper or helpee, and not being able to get out of that when someone from that group ends up being your colleague.
Interesting.
It's ego.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Thoughts from others here? Yeah, the helper gets wounded. Um, Anybody have any other thoughts out there on this? It's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say almost something very similar to Dr. Thomas's point about the helper and the helpee. And to address that, one of the things that I and I've shared this doing class, and it's been successful, is have people get in touch with who they are, their worldviews, their ideologies coming out the gate. Because you're right, if you already see, if you already see me as a minority, you're already saying I'm not in that level with you. If you already see, a BIPOC individual as marginalized, you've already got some, and not marginalized by the settlers, not marginalized by the U.S. government, etc. If that's your philosophy, then that's a little, that's ideology. That's not just a surface issue. So I have to agree with Dom on that note, that that's a tough one, coming again, speaking of the gate, but coming out the gate in this context, we are, that's a challenge. And so once you start there, and most um addressing this issue of racism, and if you go to any workshop, they're going to, number one, have you get in touch with your own worldview, because we can't forget socialization. We can't forget that we have been socialized, what, from birth to now, pretty, darn near, and that just doesn't go away overnight. And it's so interesting when I get these worldviews back, and I don't grade them, of course, on what is said in them. It is just so we know what we've been told or what we've socially learned by, you know, observation. And we don't really think about it as being critical to how we enter and navigate the world. But of course, it is. And that helps to say, wow, every time I think about this work, I go back to something my mother said, and you don't know how embedded that is until you get it, at the level of, as Dom shared, of critical consciousness, of continuously becoming critically conscious, meaning we're interrogating, we're examining, we're thinking through, we're thinking with the formal scholars and intellects, etc., and thinking with people that we wouldn't have normally ever picked a book up and thought about they got something to say, but they do. Um, so, other questions that comes up. There's lots of comments here, and we're going to, of course, have this saved if I'm not mistaken, but there is, how can we embrace scholars looking to work differently within the system? I think a lot of our work can be limited by the hoops set up that validate our work. I even think about undergrad and graduate programs. Are we just maintaining the cookie cutter mode of fulfilling these program requirements, or allowing for creativity and individuality?
That's a really good question, and it goes back into questioning the mechanics of which we operate and work within the academy. Um, so the origins of things like personal statements. So personal statements were actually developed as a way of trying to screen out Jewish students from the college admissions process because they thought too many of them were getting in. So they wanted to figure out a way in which they can figure out if someone was Jewish without having to actually directly ask them. So they relied on personal statements to do so. And just all the different like exclusionary tactics that are used as ways to, separate the cream from the rest of the crop. But how in a lot of ways, those are just actually just oppressive metrics meant to just uphold oppressive systems. So when we think about all the different things that are being used as metrics for, say, for like entrance into undergraduate or graduate school, we really have to think about, okay, where did these rules actually come from? So knowing the history of your institution, knowing the history of these mechanisms that universities operate with, and really knowing like why they're set up, and that helps you also be forewarned of some of the pitfalls of using some of these mechanisms. So something like a personal statement may seem like a good way of figuring out a person's backstory, or figuring out what life experience they may have had with a particular research area. But too often, like, people from like marginalized communities are essentially told to like pimp out their tragedy. So it's also like you're putting people it's also people being put in the position of having to like sell the worst parts of like their life in order to get enough empathy from this admissions board to let them into this school that probably already costs too much to go to anyway. So it's all the hoops that people are being made to jump through to access something that's probably going to put them in debt anyway. So just thinking about all of those things and what really is necessary and what's just meant to be there to keep people from actually creating something new and groundbreaking.
Yep.
Well, I want to take this time to thank our speakers in guiding us through this discussion, and thank you for those that engaged during the chat. This is the final session of our first virtual conference, Uprooting White Supremacy. It has been a pleasure learning from everyone, and please be on the lookout for follow-up communication about the conference. So thank you, everyone, for your presence, your time, and for sharing your gifts.